In this conversation, I explore India's quest to become a superpower with Mohamed Zeeshan. We discuss what drives India to become a superpower and what the world stands to gain from India's rise. We also go into India's unique place within South Asia, its complex relations with China and the US, New Delhi's influence at the UN, the country's model of development, the state of Indian democracy today, and many other topics. If you enjoy this conversation and would like to help the show, consider sharing this episode with a friend. Getting the word out about the show really helps us to grow and keep new episodes coming your way. Now, a bit about my guest. Mohamed Zeeshan is a foreign affairs columnist and author of Flying Blind, India's Quest for Global Leadership. He is a staff writer for The Diplomat and editor-in-chief of Freedom Gazette, an acclaimed policy advocacy site based in India. Mohamed has also worked with global consulting firms, advised governments in the Middle East on economic reform, and served with the Indian delegation to the United Nations in New York. You can follow him on Twitter at @zmohammed_. In the show notes, you will find a link to preview his book on Amazon. And now I bring you Mohamed Zeeshan. People in policy really want to make an impact, and our world needs them to succeed now more than ever. Why then, despite all our technology, are people in policy still siloed in clusters? Policy researchers lack a shared space to connect beyond their tanks. Their research struggles for attention on social media, where shallow content dominates. People in policy need their own platform, where they can connect and think outside the tank together. Welcome to Policy People. We are an online community that connects you with the people you need to succeed in policy and make a real impact on our world. And this is the Policy People Podcast. India, the influencer. I am here with Mohamed Zeeshan. Mohamed, welcome to the Policy People Podcast.
Thank you for having me, Liam. An absolute pleasure.
I am very grateful to have you on today. It's been a lovely book. Thank you for sending me a copy. I've thoroughly enjoyed reading the book. It was just a delight. And so I'm so excited to share this with our listeners and to dive in deep. I really just want to take a step back, though, Mohamed, before we dive in deep to Indian foreign policy specifically, just to sort of whet our appetite for this conversation and to really look at things from a really macro level perspective. Just want to throw you a question. Feel free to take it wherever you like, okay? Assuming it is possible to achieve, should every country aspire to global leadership, and why?
I must admit, nobody's ever asked me this question before. And, even as I wrote my book, I had it at the back of my mind that, this would be going out to international audiences. And yet some parts of the book seemed like they were talking to the Indian audience, or rather I expected them to talk to the Indian audience. Mm-hmm. But look, I think the way that I see it, I think that there is a hierarchy of needs. As we do have in our own, daily lives. Maslow came up with the pyramid of needs, at which, at the bottom is basic subsistence and survival, food, clothing, and shelter. And then as you keep going further and further up, your needs get more and more sophisticated. And at the top, you have what he calls self-actualization. I think that India, or rather foreign policy as a concept, I think the purpose of foreign policy for a country probably follows a very similar sort of hierarchy of needs. And so the basic survival, plank of it, the way that I see it is that, every country in the world, the purpose of its foreign policy should be to service and provide for the basic needs of its own people. And, that means in our globalized world today, regardless of whether you live in a small country or a large country, there is no country that is so cut off from the rest of the world that, they can survive and thrive on their own. Mm-hmm. Everybody is in some way or the other, dependent on the outside world for some resources, for some opportunities, for some trade, or whatever else it is. And so the basic purpose of the foreign policy of any country, in my view, is to serve these needs, primitive needs at first. And in order to do that, I think that the concept of influence is very important, because every country needs to have its own bargaining chips. In order to meet these needs, you need bargaining chips in order to, conduct trade negotiations favorably for your own people. You need it in order to coerce other countries to pursue policies on immigration or trade or globalization, or outsourcing, whatever else it is, that would be in sync with the needs of your own people. And so the only way to gain these bargaining chips is what I call the pursuit for influence. Now, as you go further and further up that hierarchy of needs, as I call it, obviously your country is larger, it's richer, or it's more prosperous, or it becomes more influential, it becomes more consequential, then you're not only able to do more for your own people, but you're also able to do more for the rest of the world. And as a consequence, your own people will also stand to achieve, because as a country grows in consequence, in influence, and in prosperity, then what happens outside of that country also becomes all the more consequential for that country. And so therefore, the country starts to take more of an interest in what's going on outside, in the outside world. It becomes involved, or rather its interests start expanding. Today it might be your own immediate neighborhood. Tomorrow it will be an extended neighborhood. The day after it will be the rest of the world. And so you keep growing, further and further up on this hierarchy of needs. And as your own potential or your own resources expand over time, I think that every country also has a responsibility to do what is good for the rest of the world and to pursue global good. So the interesting question, I think, as far as my book is concerned, is where does India stand?
Yes.
On the scale?
This is the question I was going to ask. you came to it yourself.
I think it's a logical debate to have, and in India this debate is ongoing in many ways, at least within diplomatic circles. When I was working with Ambassador Syed Akbaruddin, who was at the time India's permanent representative to the UN in New York, we had a casual conversation at one point where he talked about his own career and the way that he was inducted into the Indian Foreign Service. Way back in the 60s and 70s, India was dependent on food aid on the outside world. We had to basically fulfill our basic needs for survival. And as a result, I think in many ways, the mindset of Indian diplomats at the time was, how can we fulfill our need for food? How can we fulfill our need for water? And, how can we give a basic standard of living to our people? Now, a lot of those issues, I wouldn't say have gone away. It's not that India does not still, India is today a net exporter of food. And so we don't have, as such, the sort of shortages in food or famines that we were seeing back in the 60s. But at the same time, we obviously do grapple with poverty, much reduced poverty compared to what we had in the 60s, but yet it does exist, in that a lot of Indians are still struggling for their basic survival. But at the same time, I think that India, as a result of various quirky factors, its size, its young demographics, its extraordinary globalization, I think we are also very culturally globalized today. Its extremely widespread diaspora, which is incomparable in many ways to any other country. All of these things have also moved India further and further up the pyramid of needs, to a stage where I think that India is very unique in that it is still a country that does require to take certain steps to fulfill the basic survival needs of some sections of its population, and yet at the same time is able to supply vaccines to several other countries around the world, is able to have enough of a voice on the world stage on issues like climate change and others, simply as a result of its size and the size of its workforce, and the fact that India's demographics make it a very important part of the global economy in the decades ahead. And so we've got one foot further down the ladder, and one foot further up the ladder. And so my short answer is, in India's case at least, I think India is ready to pursue a larger global role. And in many ways, that would also fulfill its own domestic developmental interests and needs.
Yes, well, I think you make a very good case for that in the book. There are many different facets to that. Of course, it's one thing to want to go up that pyramid and to offer the outside world something larger, but the real next question is, well, then what is there to offer, and what exactly should New Delhi stand for on the global stage? So these are the questions you grapple with in the book, and you go into all sorts of potential policies. I would like to sort of move at a thematic approach through this conversation, Mohammed, and sort of take each topic as it comes, because it was quite an integrated argument you put forward. You devoted a chapter to the relationship with China, a chapter to the relationship with the US. A constant theme throughout the book is the importance of democracy. But I first want to begin in India's neighborhood. As you alluded to there, it's historically been where the Republic has mostly focused its diplomatic attention over the course of its history. So you speak a lot about turning South Asia from a distraction to an asset. And you have some very illuminating references in the book. You explain there's a metaphor about a grass-eating tiger, for example. And you also reference the history of the political thought of Chanakya and the large geographic continent-like form that India takes, which sort of gives it a very interesting place within its neighborhood. And you speak of the tension, to not sort of become the quote-unquote middle kingdom of South Asia, as it were. Is it not inevitable, though, that India will remain focused solely on its neighborhood? I ask this because you mention during the time of Indira Gandhi, for example, and for successive governments since, that there have been a perceived threat to the nation, to India, and that defeating those challenges has taken top priority over time. Now, I'd posit that those challenges have not really gone away at all. In fact, they may have even increased now with the return of China as a direct geopolitical threat in South Asia. So is that to say that even though India may have this ambition to kind of go global, with unrest in its neighborhood, how realistic is it that it can really sort of go beyond South Asia when it has so many challenges around it directly?
So this is a very, very valid point. My arguments on this debate are very quirky in that my basic conclusion is, in order to meet the threats that India faces in the neighborhood, particularly from China, which I think is today the largest threat that India faces in its neighborhood,
Sure.
India needs to become a more global player. India needs to build a lot more global influence, because the unfortunate fact for India is that owing to its very large size in South Asia, so there are two prongs to this. One is that you've got to win over the neighbors that you live with, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, the Maldives, Pakistan, as much as you can. But at the same time, in order to meet the threat that you're facing with China, you've actually, in some sense, got to go beyond South Asia. Because within South Asia, owing to the historical baggage that India currently carries vis-a-vis its various neighbors, and also, the psychological impact that in many ways is everlasting in the Himalayas, as a result of India's defeat in the 1962 war with China, I think China does hold a lot of the aces, in its competition with India in South Asia. But at the same time, I think that India, as a result of the fact it doesn't carry as much baggage outside of South Asia, in Africa and Latin America and in Southeast Asia and so on, and in fact, as a result of the fact that India carries a lot of political goodwill in many parts of the developing world, there are actually opportunities for India to build bargaining chips vis-a-vis China in these other parts of the world. And China is today a global power in every sense of the term, with global interests. It does economic stuff in Latin America and Africa. The Belt and Road Initiative in many ways is a very global thing. The AIIB has gone far beyond Asia itself now with its membership and so on. And China also aspires for a more global role. So China now today has interests around the world. It has interests in Latin America, in Africa, other parts of Asia, and so on. And if India is able to build bargaining chips in these other parts of the world, then it would inevitably not just become a competitor to China, but would also be able to, pose sufficient threat to Chinese interests, if you will, in these other parts of the world, and then use that as leverage against China when we have trouble in South Asia and in the Himalayas. And so the argument I make in my book, as well as in some of my articles in the world media recently, in the aftermath of the Ladakh conflict, is that China, in some sense, wants to keep India preoccupied in South Asia. It doesn't want India to ally with the US around the world. It doesn't want India to sit in the Security Council as a permanent member. It doesn't want India to be in the NSG or any of these multilateral forums. And so, it keeps India preoccupied in South Asia also as a result of these incursions and skirmishes in the Himalayas. The logical conclusion being that China believes that so long as India is preoccupied with whatever is happening in the Himalayas or with Pakistan and so on, India will not have enough resources and brain power to actually invest outside of South Asia to build its global footprint and global influence. So India has to defeat this logic, I think, in many ways, by actually going outside of South Asia and countering China in other parts of the world where India has far less of a disadvantage, if you will, as compared to South Asia. But at the same time, let me caveat this by saying that at no point anywhere in my book am I saying that India has to neglect South Asia. In fact, one of the earlier chapters in the book, before even the China and US chapters, is about South Asia. Yes. And so I do not say, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, for instance, has what he calls a neighborhood first policy. And even when India conducted its vaccine diplomacy, the earliest beneficiaries were in the neighborhood. They were all, parts of the SAARC, South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. And I think that that's all very good, because if there is a veto vote in some sense on India's global aspirations and interests, that would be in South Asia. And to win over our South Asian neighbors in many ways should certainly continue to be one of our objectives. I would argue we have not been going very far in terms of winning over them, for various reasons, political reasons primarily. But if India wants to win over its neighbors, it would have to conduct a somewhat more philanthropic, one-sided foreign policy, if you will, without expecting benefit to come from the other side of the table for a very sustained period of time. Because there is a huge trust deficit, I think, within South Asia, which India needs to overcome. And so insofar as a neighborhood first policy is concerned, I think the first thing that India needs to do is to try and bridge this gap in trust, rather than expecting immediate returns, expecting Sri Lanka to eschew and avoid all ties with China tomorrow, and so on and so forth. I don't think that should be a part of our neighborhood focus at all.
Right. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think almost you could say the largesse that you're referring to there, whereby India must recognize that it is, by sheer virtue of its scale, on a whole nother level in terms of the resources it has compared to its neighbors, such that it needs to take an approach of exactly being generous and trying to establish regional commons and assets that the region can enjoy without expecting a sort of a favor in return all the time. This, to me, sounds like the necessary steps for New Delhi to cultivate the mentality for global leadership eventually, because as you just referenced in the beginning, it's actually taking the step to provide for the global community and to provide to other countries and people in other countries. That is the definition of global leadership. So this seems to me, what you're referring to there, creating resources and showing diplomatic goodwill without always expecting something in return, that seems like the very first step within India's immediate region as a stepping stone onto global leadership as well.
Right.
Although I'd like to just quickly reference Chanakya's mandala theory, right? It seems to me that the kind of worldview that you sort of mapped out just there about how at this point in time, and China sort of holds the aces in South Asia, however, India has a lot more political goodwill in other parts of the world, is that not basically, in a nutshell, the driving theme of Chanakya's mandala theory there? Have I got that right, Mohammed? Is that basically the idea? Is that the neighboring kingdoms are always sort of going to have animosity between each other because they're on each other's borders, but kingdoms further away are more likely to be allies? Is that basically what's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting reading of Chanakya's mandala theory. You're basically right in that Chanakya does say that neighbors are in some sense preordained to be enemies, and so your neighbor's neighbor is your neighbor's enemy, and your enemy's enemy is your friend. So it's in some sense transitive property, if you will, for the mathematicians and scientists out there. But where I would sort of defer or depart from Chanakya's theory is in saying that it's not necessary that your neighbors are always going to be threats. Yes, today they are threats because there is a deficit in trust. In Chanakya's time, a lot of the kingdoms in the Indian subcontinent were actually trying to expand their territorial expanse or reach. And, obviously that's what kingdoms at the time were doing. They were imperialist. And so you were always eyeing your neighbor's territory. You wanted to annex it. There would be agricultural produce and revenue out of it and so on. And so the driving thrust or purpose of foreign policy in the Indian subcontinent was to, in some sense, snatch your neighbor's land away. Now, in today's context, although one would argue that in Kashmir, some of that is playing out, it's not true that India and Sri Lanka, for instance, have that sort of a dynamic going on, or India and Bangladesh have that sort of, there are obviously boundary disputes here and there, some legacies of colonial rule. You don't know where the boundary line stands and so on and so forth. But none of these countries, India included, is actually thinking that the primary purpose of their foreign policy should be snatched to snatch their neighbor's territory, which is what was happening in Chanakya's time. Right. And so as a result, I think that, if you look at the rest of the world, if you look at the ASEAN or the EU and so on, even ECOWAS in West Africa, which is one of the examples I write about in some part of my book, these are neighbors who have managed to bridge the trust deficit, at least to some extent, historical trust deficit, at least to some extent, and build some kind of a common purpose to pursue together, and are pursuing that common purpose extraordinarily well. And, countries like Indonesia, countries like Germany have actually stood to gain tremendously in their global aspirations and larger, greater neighborhood aspirations. They've stood to gain tremendously from the goodwill and cooperation of their own neighbor. The EU adds tremendously to German national influence and global power. The ASEAN adds tremendously to the influence of Thailand and Indonesia and Malaysia and other countries in their global aspirations and global leadership power. And so there's no reason why India cannot get to that stage, in my view, with South Asia. It's not going to happen, as I said, tomorrow or the next year or 3 years from now. It might not even happen, 2 or 3 prime ministers down the line. But, in a couple of decades' time, 3 decades' time at least, I think that if we do sustain that sort of philanthropic approach and we make it the primary goal of India's neighborhood foreign policy should be to actually, tide over and bridge this trust deficit. First of all, to accept and acknowledge that the trust deficit exists, and then look for ways at the political level, I think at the prime minister's level, under successive governments, to look for ways to bridge that trust deficit across the neighborhood. Then I think that South Asia as well, for various reasons that I've also explained in my own book, South Asia can also stand up for Indian interests and India's common interest in the neighborhood on the world stage, just as the EU does for Germany or the ASEAN does for its member states. It's very possible.
And you go into much more detail in the book about those possibilities, which I found quite fascinating. However, Mohammed, I do just want to bring us back to China a little bit more, because I do think it warrants a bit more attention. Speaking of rivalries, of course, right now, the Sino-Indian ties are at a low point right now, but it wasn't always this way. A few years ago, there was a lot of talk about the Wuhan spirit and Asia's giants together shaping the new century. Of course, over the last few years, this has all deteriorated rather quickly. You talk about China being the greatest threat to India's rise on the global stage. Is it inevitable that the two will continue to clash? I mean, will it always be this way? Does India have to counter China as much as possible in order to increase its influence globally? Or is there another possibility here?
I mean, I've always been a skeptic of India-China ties, and I think that comes through in my book. I must confess, when I wrote the China chapter of my book and all the hawkish stuff in there, it was actually written before the recent border conflagration took place.
Oh, really?
I wrote it in the early part of 2020, late part of 2019. The Ladakh conflict or dispute took off, a few months later. To be honest, I was also a little bit dismayed that my prescience is going to be lost on the global public, because I kind of did write in my book, as you would remember, that there are several reasons for why China would see India as a threat, and India should see China as a threat. I think that there is a very, very important divergence of interest to look at here between the two countries. It's not very clear as yet, because India has not exactly articulated what it wants to do on the world stage. And China has also been, in my view, China knows exactly what it wants to do. But as Deng Xiaoping said, they bide their time. It's only more recently that China has stopped biding its time, and it's looking to be a lot more aggressive in setting the global agenda, in setting global norms and so on. And the AIIB and other such institutions are clear examples of what China wants to stand for. Now, I think that in India's case, I think that is a very clear ideological divergence. And it's underplayed tremendously in Indian foreign policy, because, as I said, India has not made clear what it wants to stand for on the world stage. But ideology matters, because at the end of the day, ideology is what drives what you stand for on the world stage. It drives at a practical level what sort of global norms you believe in, or what sort of global norms you vote for at the UN and in other institutions. Whether you want the South China Sea to be a region of free trade and free navigation, or whether you want it to be part of the 9-dash line of China. All of these things stem basically from the ideology that country pursues in its domestic politics, as well as in its outlook to the rest of the world. And in India's case, as a result of its democracy, its private sector-driven economy, its globalized society, its widespread diaspora abroad, and so on, India has very strong long-term interests, I think, in standing up for democracy and human rights and freedom of navigation in the seas, and all of these sorts of things that you would call as "quote unquote" the liberal world order of the day.
Sure.
And China, for various reasons of its own, domestic political interests and economic interests and so on, which I explain in detail in my book, does not like these norms, does not like the way that today's global institutions function. And so it would like to change the way that they work. And we saw that in the way that the WHO essentially responded early on to COVID-19. And I've written about that example in my book as well, as a contrast to the way that the WHO reacted to the SARS epidemic in the early 2000s. And it's another, in my view at least, a very clear sign of what China wants to see on the world stage. Now, as far as India is concerned and what to do about this, I think the first thing India needs to decide upon is its own long-term interests in foreign policy. What sort of norms it wants to stand for in global governance? What sort of norms it wants to vote for at the UN? And how should the UN look when it functions? What kind of rules and procedures should it stand for? Because when India starts doing this, I think, and it should obviously be based on India's domestic political and economic interests, India should, in my view, India will start to see that there is a divergence or conflict of interest with what China is saying or what China stands for, or what is in China's interest in the long term. I think what has happened up until now is, as I said, a sort of a fake bonhomie. I think that, we've had conflagrations at the border for several years, and they are cyclical. They occur, as I draw it in my book, at least for the last 1 decade, they've been happening every 3 years. They happen in Arunachal Pradesh, they happen in Ladakh, and then they happen again in Ladakh, they happen in Doklam, and so on. And after every such conflagration, there is a handshake, there is some bonhomie, there is de-escalation, there is Wuhan spirit, and so on. And then India joins the AIIB and all of these sorts of things. But again, they recur after a few years because, in my view, as I explained in the book and as I just said, China wants to keep India contained and China wants to keep India preoccupied.
Yes.
Because in my view, China actually sees that there is a threat from India's rise as a global power.
I got it. Right. Well, I think you make a very clear case about China's heading in a different direction. The reader is still sort of left to wonder perhaps, well, exactly what are New Delhi's values to contrast it. It's sort of like India at this point knows it's not China and it's not going to take follow China's path. However, yes, exactly. India needs to do a bit of soul searching to make a more bold statement and to come out and really have a sense of purpose and a long-term agenda for its own rise to global leadership. Core to that is democracy. So, Mohamed, I'd really like to take a deep dive into democracy here, which is one of the dominant themes in the book. You frequently refer to the stability of Indian democracy as being one of the country's greatest assets and one of the means by which it can lead the rest of the world, and that it can offer a counterpoint to communist China's state-centric model, as I just said. Now, one of the reasons you are bullish about India's influence here is the enduring appeal of democracy around the world. You cite a couple of statistics. By the mid-2000s, 60% of the world's countries were democratic, as opposed to 40% in the 1990s. I would say, from many of the authors I've read over the last 12 to 18 months, you would be one of the most optimistic in this regard compared to many other writers. I'm not sure how you see yourself in that way. It's very fashionable to talk about democracy entering a twilight period in decline, etc. So firstly, I'd like to ask you why you are so optimistic about democracy on a global level. And then I'd like to ask you a bit more about the state of India's democracy. But why don't we first just answer that question specifically? Why are you really optimistic, really bullish about democracy globally going forward?
No, that's a very, very interesting point. I was aware of it as even as I wrote, people are going to say, here goes this guy again. He's naive. He's ignorant. He's being overly optimistic about stuff that's not true. But, there are a couple of reasons that I see for why people have started becoming, or rather, I shouldn't say people, I should say commentators and writers and academics have started becoming somewhat more pessimistic about democracy.
Sure.
The first reason is that the Arab Spring sort of failed.
That's a good point.
In that, apart from Tunisia to some extent, other parts of the Arab world, Syria has been an absolute disaster. Iraq has been an absolute disaster. Libya has been an absolute disaster. So, there are many reasons in the Arab world that people look at to say, these people want a democracy, and look at what they got, so they don't want democracy anymore. And the second reason, I think, is that they look at the status of democracy in more advanced democracies like the US, like Europe, Australia, India, and so on. And they say, look at the rise of populism, look at the rise of ethnic nationalism, the hounding of minorities, the way that people, treat immigrants, and so on. And so, that is the rise of illiberal democracy in some sense, and authoritarianism. And so people decide, therefore, that democracy is on the wane. But I think if you take a wider look at the world, my core argument is that the aspirations of people in most parts of the world for democracy is still high. People want to hold their governments accountable because they know what unaccountable governments have looked like. It has looked like Robert Mugabe, it has looked like Ben Ali in Tunisia, it's looked like Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and so on. And so people, they know that they don't want that. They want to have a democracy that is accountable to the wishes of the electorate. Now, the Arab Spring, in many ways, as I argue in my book, failed because not because people did not want democracy, but because it takes a tremendous amount of effort and time in order to build a democracy, and some amount of external help and support as well in doing that. And unfortunately, the Arab world did not get that. I think Tunisia, to some extent, got it at the right time. I think that timely intervention is very important. The building of a democratic culture is very important, and so on. And the Arab world did not get that during the Arab Spring. And so as a result, you ended up with absolute anarchy in the place of socialist dictatorships. But the aspirations of people for democracy, I think, is still there. It's very real. They just don't want to go through another revolution in order to get that, because they just don't know how that's going to turn out, or rather they know that it's going to turn out as badly as it did the last time. But yet, if you look at Africa, for instance, which is one of the examples I quote in my book, they go through, countries in Africa go through recurring civil wars every few years, because they try democracy once, it doesn't work out. They try again, it doesn't work out, because the people at the forefront of these struggles, they go to power and then they start building their own authoritarian regime. The process of state building, the process of building state institutions that can uphold democracy, like an independent Supreme Court, like a culture of free press, like an independent election commission, and so on. These are things that take a long period of time. And the international community has typically shown a short fuse with these things. As soon as the fighting stops, they all want to leave and then leave that country to its own devices. And as a result, they're back in that country again after a few years because the UN Security Council is talking about it as a crisis of international security. And we've been seeing this in the Central African Republic, in Congo, and so on. But again, the basic aspirations of the people, that they want a government that is accountable to the electorate, that they can ask questions of, that is transparent, that can be changed if it is not working well. All of these aspirations, I think, are fairly universal and pretty widespread. And that is what makes pretty bullish about democracy as an instrument of soft power.
Right. So in a nutshell, basically, especially in the developing or those parts of the world where authoritarian is still the norm, democracy still holds great appeal. However, it is building the institutions and the cultures to actually make democracy work. That is the tricky part. That is the part where the people are stumbling at this point in time. Now, this is where India comes in. Right. And this is your argument that essentially, India's democracy is not only very stable and has been for much of its history, but India also shares a lot in common, whether it's demographically or economically, in terms of the size or the sheer diversity of India, with some of the regions of the developing world, which it can serve as a model to those countries to say, we have a very stable democracy here, and we also deal with poverty, we also deal with all these other huge policy problems that afflict the developing world too. So, take a leaf out of our book. Now, I think that's a tremendous idea, and this is something that India should crow on a little bit more about. However, we also now come to a second, perhaps even more pressing issue that you devote the epilogue to discussing, and that is the current state of democracy in India. Now, there seems to be an unfortunate update just to add to this. Last week or a couple of weeks ago, Freedom House's latest report downgraded India from a free to partly free country, which has set off a heated discussions in India, of course. I'm wondering, how do you reconcile these downward domestic trends with your conviction that Indian democracy will continue to be a pillar of the country's global influence going forward into the future?
No, this is a very, very important part of my book. I think if Indians, are in a hurry, an Indian reader wants to read only one chapter in the book, I would say read the epilogue.
Okay.
Read the introduction and preface, but definitely read the epilogue, and because I think that in many ways, India cannot become a global power without its democracy. I'm pretty certain about that. I think there is no doubt in my view, in my mind about it. Because we are not China, first of all. You pointed out that India is not on the same path as China. The unfortunate footnote to that is that there is a significant section of the Indian population that looks at China, that looks at South Korea, and so on, and says, the East Asian model was built on authoritarianism. Only after you reach a certain level of income, you can become a democracy. So we are too early for democracy, and so on and so forth. But this is a horrible sentiment for several reasons. One, there are several other countries around the world that tried this, and it did not work. It went very, very badly. It creates a certain bit of wealth. I think authoritarian leaders do create a little bit of wealth in their early years. Ruchir Sharma writes about this in a couple of his books, one of which is called The Rise and Fall of Nations. He talks about the role that authoritarian leadership has played. And also in his book, Breakout Nations, where he talks about the examples of Turkey and Russia. Authoritarian populist leaders do in these countries create, not in all countries, by the way, but only some, Turkey and Russia being a couple of them. They do create some wealth in the early part of their term, but then they get deeply entrenched in the power structure. And then after they cross 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, they become as bad as any other authoritarian autocratic leader in the rest of the world. And as a result, what you see is that there is a stagnation in the economy. There is rampant crony capitalism. Only some parts of the country do well. Other parts of the country are very, very backward. There is widespread inequality and so on. And so as a result, the country essentially spirals down that path of stagnation, lack of growth in some sense economically. And Russia is in that phase right now.
Yes.
Where Russia, I think, has been in a recession for a while now. Nobody's talking about it. And Venezuela has now gone down the same path. In the post-Chavez era, Hugo Chavez made money for Venezuela by digging minerals out of the ground. But once that one-sided, one-dimensional economic model failed because of China's slowdown, Venezuela has become a basket case as well. So the list of examples of failed authoritarian states is very, very long. And so Indians would do well, as I explain and argue in my book, to learn from the mistakes of the rest of the world, becoming better acquainted with the rest of the world, and learning more about what's happening in these authoritarian regimes whose models of development some parts of our population seem to aspire for. On the other hand, the other reason I think that this sort of a model is bound to fail in a country like India is simply because we are too vast and diverse. There are far too many identity groups, far too many interest groups. You cannot have one sort of a Hindu Rashtra model imposed upon an India that even within the Hindu population itself practices several different strains of Hinduism and several different beliefs, some of which actually run counter to other beliefs within Hinduism. And then, of course, you've got hundreds of millions of people that are not Hindus as well within India. So you cannot impose, I think, that sort of a China-style model that is a sort of an ethnic nationalist state on India. It seems to me that even the China model is reaching the end of its, or rather the limits of its capacity and capability, as we see in Xinjiang, in Tibet, and so on. These are parts of China that are going to be the future workforce of China. And so China is scrambling very quickly to, in some sense, try to homogenize them, as I explain in my book. So China is also now figuring out that there are limits to this model. And it's trying to go the other way in trying to homogenize vast parts of the minority population in the renegade provinces. India is never going to be able to do that under any government. And I explain that in India's millennia-old history. There have been emperors that have tried to homogenize and make uniform India's population, and they have all failed very, very spectacularly. So there is no reason why in the Democratic Republic of India a government is going to be able to succeed in this sort of a thing. Much better would be to actually continue on India's path of democratic development, that has actually served India pretty well since 1991.
I think they make a pretty good case for that. And I think in terms of offering models of Indian development to the developing world, I thought as I was reading your book, what about empowering states, as in the provinces within India? States such as Kerala, Gujarat, these are often held up as models for development in different ways. We hear, for example, about Kerala's under the freely elected socialist government there. We heard about high literacy rates. I mean, there was a lot of discussion about that by the media in the Western world, let alone in the developing world. I mean, there's such a smorgasbord, I think that's one term you used at one point in your book, of various experiments that India has done, over the years in different parts of the country. In Gujarat, of course, where Prime Minister Modi was formerly the chief minister of Gujarat. And so, that also had a record levels of development there. So, should Delhi not be trying to cut loose the states and promote their offerings as single case models for various countries around the world, rather than, I think that maybe one of the issues with perceiving India's rise, or even what India has to offer, is because of its diversity, the outside world is often so confounded by India. They often sort of look at India and say, well, where do we start? Because it is so diverse, it's not homogenous. So what do you think of that suggestion?
Yeah, that's a very interesting suggestion. You're absolutely right. India can be very confusing. I've got a number of my friends who wanted to come to India as tourists, and they said, well, where do I start? From the head or the toe, the left arm, the right arm, where do I go first? And,
yes.
Each part of India, as you said, has something different to offer. I actually think that this is a very, very good strategy, for Indian foreign policy. What has happened in recent years is that a number of Indian states, including Modi when he was chief minister of Gujarat, have tried to actually go out to the outside world on their own. So state governments have been holding investor summits in their capital cities. They have been inviting, foreign delegations to come from foreign governments as well as foreign businesses. And they have been trying to showcase their models to the outside world to say, come and invest in Gujarat, or come and invest in Bengal. This is what we believe in. Come to Kerala. This is what we believe in.
Okay.
And so on and so forth. And this has worked fairly well. But I think, this sort of an approach so far has been very transactional in nature. It's been very restricted for various obvious reasons. These state governments have only gone so far as to talk about their own policies and then do that with the single-minded objective of trying to bring in foreign investment from the outside world. Or at least, ink some kind of MOUs with foreign governments on infrastructure projects and, that sort of stuff. They've never taken it to a political strategic level because that would obviously require sanction from New Delhi and the foreign ministry, because the foreign ministry would want to show one united face of India. And that is fairly reasonable an objective and pursuit to have. The other thing is that, obviously, the state government could be governed by a different party, and the central government could be governed by a different political party. And so there is some competition between the two. And so, there have been controversies in the past where the prime minister has essentially trashed the models of development in Bengal and Kerala. I think at one point in one of his speeches, he said Kerala is like Somalia, with all due respect to Somalia, I assume. And so, as a result, what we see is that there is a certain level of political competition that would hinder that sort of an approach. But nonetheless, I think that it would be in India's interest, really, to actually bring together these different models of development within India. And start showcasing that to the outside world. It would be in India's national interest to do that because, as I write my book, as you pointed out, India is a developmental laboratory for the rest of the world. And so we borrow lessons, we try things out, and then we want to share those lessons with the outside world. And the foreign ministry should seriously think about doing that.
Yes, and I think a lot of countries, for example, in Latin America and Africa, in terms of the size of their population, their territory, a lot of them will be much more akin to one state of India rather than, obviously all of India. So it would sort of make much more sense. I think, the leaders of those countries could wrap their heads around thinking, okay, well, let's try out Kerala's model. Like they've got a roughly similar sized population, or, our resources are somewhat similar, or if that doesn't work, okay, well, let's consider other models, so I think there's a lot of potential for that.
Absolutely.
Mohamed, I'd like to move along to the India-US relationship, which again you devote a chapter to in the book, which I found very enjoyable to read. I was reading through it, and one sentence really jumped right out at me, which I'd love to dig into. You offer quite a surprising, but I think also a profound observation, and I quote, "India has a unique identity crisis. It is an instinctively Western country in Eastern clothes." Can you elaborate on what you mean by this, and why you believe India's interests will increasingly converge with Washington's over the course of this century?
No, I mean, I must admit, I showed the manuscript of this chapter to one of my friends while I was drafting it for her review and comments, and she was a little taken aback with some of the suggestions and statements that I've made.
Sure.
And this was one of those statements. How dare you compare India to the US and say that we are like them? And people in India sometimes think of the U.S. and then associate it with the Iraq War and with failed interventions in Vietnam and Korea and all of that.
Neo-imperialism, yes.
Yeah, and neo-imperialism, absolutely. And they say that India should, under no circumstances, be like the U.S. Those are fair arguments. But the context in which I, of course, approach this in my book is to say that even though India is geographically of the East, and maybe to some extent also culturally of the East, it is much more globalized than any other Eastern country. Indians listen to a lot more Western music than people in, say, Japan or China. We watch a lot more American movies, American TV shows, Friends, Brooklyn Nine-Nine, what have you. We read a lot more American literature and so on, and we also speak a lot more English. Obviously, I think according to one survey, India has almost as many, if not more, English speakers than America has, and that is quite extraordinary thing that people actually forget. But also at the same time, India is a Western democracy in many senses of the word. Our people, or rather, founding fathers of our republic, many of them were actually educated in America, in Britain, and so on. They collaborated with academics from the Western world. They borrowed in many ways philosophies of the Western world in politics and government, and drafted the Constitution in that light. Of course, we also kept true to some of the very unique Indian characteristics and tried to evolve solutions to those. But essentially speaking, our democracy is a Western democracy. It's not an Eastern democracy because our Constitution is written in that manner, and that has worked well for us in the last 7 decades. Whether people who are dissatisfied with the policy paralysis of democracy agree or not, it has actually served India pretty well in the last 7 decades. And so, as a result of all of these reasons, and several other reasons as well that I explain in that chapter of the book, India has several intrinsic political and economic interests that are very common with those of the US. It's private sector driven investment, both at home and abroad. The fact that Indian businesses go and invest abroad and require the sort of rule of law environment that American private sector businesses look for. American private sector, unlike Chinese investment, does not go to countries like Afghanistan or Venezuela.
No.
They go to countries where there is a certain level of rule of law because that's what you require in order to run a business successfully and make profit.
Yes.
And I draw this out in my book along with a comparison with China as well. So there are several reasons such as these that actually make a lot of these interests, American interests in some sense, as we think about them, also Indian interests. And as I argue on some of these interests, such as human rights and democracy, India actually has a lot more to gain than America has gained traditionally by promoting or advocating democratic ideals and values around the world. And so as a result, I think that this should be in many ways a century-defining partnership.
Yes, no, I think you've raised some really interesting, thought-provoking points there, and so that's what I enjoy. You know, such statements like this can often be a little provocative and sort of leap off the page at you, but it really takes the reader to get up and question their own preconceptions of things. So I think you make some very interesting points there. I'm just speaking, though, if we, turning sort of more to the Western world, I'm also fascinated by your suggestion that India should join the Five Eyes program. For listeners who are perhaps not so aware of that, it's a joint collaboration between 5 countries, English-speaking countries around the world, so with the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, to share intelligence between each other, and very, very high level intelligence. So I believe this is a very interesting suggestion, worth considering for sure. Could be a big move, not only for India but for other member countries as well. You discussed the merits and the possible limitations of this in the book, but I am curious about your comment about India's intelligence capabilities, that India's intelligence capabilities are quite weak. Why is this? And if so, would the Five Eyes member countries gain anything from India joining? I'm also interested about what you wrote, and I quote, "If America is committed to developing India into a future global power, it needs to invest in India's security and intelligence agencies." So would letting India into this secret Five Eyes club be the best way to do this? Or should the US, create another sort of two-eyed framework per se, US-Indian framework just between the two countries? I mean, what do you think about all this?
No, that is a very interesting, complicated question to wrap one's mind around. But I mean, I did suggest, I think, probably not all that seriously that India should now join the Five Eyes. I mean, in the ideal world, frankly speaking, I would like India to be there because, as I said, the common convergence of interests is so very strong, and there's no reason why India shouldn't be there, in my view. At least, apart from
also an English-speaking country, seems
yes,
to be
I certainly would
seems
say.
to be the definition for the membership.
Absolutely, and I think India should qualify even on those grounds. All of our diplomats pretty much do speak English, but it's hard for me to answer why India's intelligence capabilities are seen as weak or inadequate. But an intelligence agent or somebody who has worked in the raw or an intelligence agency would be able to throw a lot more light on that and also actually provide a fairer view of whether that assessment is correct or not. My assessment on this was based on the idea that India has struggled for several years with its border security issues with Pakistan. I mean, take nothing away from our soldiers and intelligence agents. These are some of the most hostile environments on planet Earth to operate in. And they've done tremendously well. But I think that India also would concede that in relation or in comparison to what the CIA does, for instance, or what America does, or what the MI6 does, India's capabilities technologically as well as in terms of skill are not quite yet there. We have been growing leaps and bounds in the last several decades. A large part of why this is the reason, or a large part of why this is the case, is that obviously India started out from a lower base. We had much lesser money to invest on military and intelligence capabilities when we became independent, whereas the US and the UK had already fought a world war or 2 world wars by that point. India also at that point in time under Prime Minister Nehru decided that India should prioritize more on other parts of economic domestic development rather than pour a tremendous amount of money into the military until we fought that war with China in 1962. And then India decided to make a strategic shift. So we are sort of behind the curve in many ways as a result of these historical factors. But we have been growing in recent years for sure. For instance, the cross-border strikes that we conducted in Myanmar a few years ago, as well as a cross-border strike that we conducted in Pakistan a couple of years ago. These are all testaments, I think, to the fact that India's hard power and intelligence capabilities are also growing very steadily. Now, what would the Five Eyes gain by having India? I think, I would tie this to your other question on whether the US should approach India outside of the Five Eyes in order to invest in developing India's capabilities. I think that's a very fair argument to make because the rest of the Five Eyes, in many ways, probably would not gain as much from India because they do not have as global a spread of interest as America does in the Asia Pacific. Perhaps Australia and New Zealand might gain because they are in the region. The UK has very limited presence in the region. Canada has very limited presence in the region. And so maybe the Quad would be a very interesting platform as well to look at to do this with India. But I think India is very, very important, at least to America, if not the rest of the Five Eyes, as well as to Australia, because China is now an emerging threat to all of these countries.
Yes.
Geographically speaking, India is in the neighborhood of China. So the Indian Ocean is in India's neighborhood. Southeast Asia is in India's neighborhood. India can easily build capabilities and reach in order to protect or safeguard common interests of the Quad countries as well as America and Australia and the rest of the Five Eyes in these parts of the world where China is.
We see things, for example, in the Andaman Islands, some new facilities being built there.
That's right, absolutely, the Andaman Islands. And then, of course, there are the more obvious reasons that India has young demographics. It's an important part of the future global economy. If America and its allies would like to counter Chinese influence, then India would be a very obvious candidate to do that for the long run. And, we see that already with the Quad summit very recently, where the Quad decided to actually pour in money and invest on India's capacity to manufacture vaccines for COVID-19, so that India is able to act as a counterweight to China in supplying vaccine doses to Southeast Asia, countries in the Indian Ocean, and so on, which are always under the influence of China or trying to break away from the influence of China. So India would be a very, very useful counterweight.
Sure.
So that was a very, very good example, I think, of how America and its allies would gain from heightened or expanded capabilities of the Indian state.
Yes, and you also mentioned the US has been a big supporter of India's rise, and I think this is fairly well known in America. I think there may be often some skepticism from the Indian public, especially over the last couple of decades, especially during the war on terror. There's a lot of media attention was devoted to Washington's ongoing support of Islamabad. So you didn't really go too far into the Pakistan relationship in the book, which, whatever reason, I think that's probably not a bad thing, but can give the reader a bit of a break from that particular dynamic, and we can focus on other questions. So I don't want to go into the Pakistan sort of relationship right now, but just as a reference point, I think people often view the US as having backed the wrong side there for many years. Regardless of that, you bring up some pretty good points that remind the reader that the US has really tried to accelerate India's rise in global politics for quite some time. One of the examples you give of that is their support for New Delhi joining the UN Security Council. Now, how does India make its case for a permanent position on the UN Security Council? Why has the influence of the US not been enough to achieve that goal at this point in time? What else sort of needs to happen to make that a reality, Mohammed?
This is a very, very important question for Indian foreign policy thinkers to ponder over because India does invest a lot more political capital as well as money, if you will, on its Security Council aspirations. I've seen it also at close quarters during my short stint at the UN with the Indian mission. India does care very, very, very much about its aspirations for a Security Council seat. And I give examples of things that demonstrate that in my book as well, much more than other aspirants for a Security Council seat. So the question also needs to be asked, I think, of New Delhi, well, if you care about this so much, then why is it not happening, or how do you expect to make it happen?
Sure.
Now, the answer in my mind is that, first of all, this is an extraordinarily difficult challenge because a tremendous amount of institutional inertia has to be won over, tremendously difficult majorities have to be won over. In some sense, for India or any other country to join the Security Council as a permanent member, the UN needs to be broken down and remade from the bottom up.
Oh, okay.
It cannot. It's not like it's not like amending the constitution in India and removing the autonomy of Jammu and Kashmir. It's not like that. It's not like a change in the law books, because you need to essentially overcome very difficult barriers from China and other veto-wielding, or rather only China, the veto-wielding country that would veto India's membership here. But in order to do that, I think my argument would be that you need to, in some sense, become so very important in Security Council affairs that the Security Council is in effect not able to function properly and fulfill its own interests without counting you as a member.
Right.
And so India, therefore, has to become important to the issues that the Security Council deals with. Africa is about 2/3 of the Security Council's business. But India has no political stance on any of the civil wars that are raging in Africa today and have been for several years, apart from some platitudes on sovereignty and so on and so forth, that honestly speaking, even India does not know why it stands for sovereignty in these countries, but it does.
Okay.
And so these things, I think, need to be resolved for India to be able to build influence in the Security Council.
Right. So Washington supports India joining. Does Russia?
Yes, Russia has in the past publicly proclaimed support for India's permanent membership, but I think that can change over time. I think if India becomes a global power serious enough to run as a contender for the Security Council, I expect Russia to change that and say we're going to sit on the fence.
That's interesting.
Or we're going to go with China. But they have in the past publicly proclaimed that. Yeah.
And so at the moment, is it sort of by virtue of India being a nuclear power? I mean, what exactly, if New Delhi hasn't taken a proactive enough stance on these, as you say, African civil wars and sovereignty issues, I mean, what is its claim to say, well, perhaps we don't need to do that because what? Is it the nuclear factor? Or?
I mean, I think that India, from the statements that the Indian government has made, we are talking in large part more about our potential in international security, more than just our current role, but also we're making the somewhat more romantic argument that we represent 1/5 of humanity. We are a very large economy, and the nuclear power part never comes up there because India is a bit sensitive about these optics. India does not want to be seen as a country that wants to bully its way through international politics by using its nuclear weaponry. Although even that doctrine is currently under debate in India. And Vipin Narang, for instance, who studies nuclear policies across countries, has been talking a little bit in recent times about India's so-called commitment to its no first use policy, because our former defense minister has made some controversial comments on that front. But nonetheless, India still wants to be seen as a sort of sagely soft power on the world stage, teaching the world how to do yoga and selling tea and all of that sort of stuff. And we expect that, or rather, I think that we hope that this is going to make the world want to give us a Security Council seat. Now, in my book, of course, I argue for practical, rational reasons, so that's not going to happen. But at the same time, even as a realist, I'm saying that it's not entirely impossible that India actually manages to make this happen. If there is any country in the world that can actually build that sort of global influence in the decades to come, India is the only country that can do that because we are the only ones that are young and large enough to build that sort of influence on the world stage. But in order to do that, we need to start taking much more of a proactive stance.
Okay.
In some sense, stop flying blind in the quest for global leadership.
To plug the book's title there. Perfect placement. I would just like to now move on to, as you mentioned, this New Delhi consensus, as you phrase it, India promoting renewed multilateralism and even so-called South-to-South cooperation. This all feels very Nehruvian in spirit, Mohammed. But as you say, it should be aimed at tackling current development issues around the world and new 21st century problems. You emphasize the importance of respecting state sovereignty, yet you also add that India should focus on empowering the interests of the citizenry as a means of doing this. So an idea that came to me as I was reading through this chapter. It seems that there is a middle path here for India between China and its state-led transactional model of funding and those Western-led institutions like the World Bank that push for liberal reform in recipient countries as a part of their agenda. So what I want to ask you here, Mohammed, is do you see that microloans could potentially play a role in India's future multilateral forums? I mean, India has a lot of experience with these schemes, and it seems that it would offer a direct alternative to the usual large lump sums that are handed straight over to the governments of developing countries, whose leaders do not always use those funds for the public good.
Right.
So what do you think of this idea? I mean, could it work?
This is a very good idea, but I think, I steered clear of trying to provide somewhat more financial policy solutions in my book because I think, from a fiscal or financial standpoint, India is definitely at a disadvantage relative to China or the United States. We don't have that sort of money to spend. We do spend some money, obviously, on projects such as the Chabahar port project in Iran and, the multimodal oil transport and energy transport pipeline and so on. And we've also got a few highway projects in South Asia running through Myanmar and Bangladesh and so on and so forth. But we've traditionally just struggled to implement these sorts of projects because, frankly speaking, they are things that we also struggle to do domestically.
Sure.
Building roads is not an Indian strength. People who have been to India would attest to that.
Yes.
But,
okay.
at the same time, I think, what I see is that maybe India can make up for this weakness in some sense until it gets rectified over a period of time.
Sure.
By using its political capital and the fact that it's got a functional state model that can work for the rest of the world. And so where I see this as a midway path between America and China is, China obviously has a somewhat very different state-led model and Chinese state model compared to the Indian democratic model of governance and the way that India makes its policies. America, on the other hand, has a tendency to lecture from, how do you put it?
Moralistic.
Pretty much a moralistic stance. And the rest of the world pretty much, I think, apart from the interventionist part of it, I think the rest of the world does not appreciate being lectured down to.
Sure.
Now, in India's case, I think what can happen is in building the Delhi Consensus, which is essentially a knowledge-sharing platform for development across countries. I think more similar in some sense to the G20 or the WEF than to the World Bank or the AIIB. I think this is something India can do very successfully because, first of all, India already does it at a bilateral level. There's no reason why we can't scale it up to a multilateral level. And there would be several reasons and benefits that would accrue out of that. And the other thing is that India, rather than lecturing down to the rest of the world, can actually be a partner in development to the rest of the world because we've also got the same challenges. We're a little bit more advanced in some things. We struggle a little bit more in other things. So what we are a little bit more advanced on, we share with you. You use it as you wish. And what we struggle a little bit on, we learn from you, and then we try to implement and apply that in our domestic developmental context. So this is the idea behind the Delhi Consensus. Now, I do want to say one thing about the sovereignty part of it, though, because I
Yes.
also mentioned that we share with you and use it as you will. Now, this sort of a thing is for somewhat more stable states, not countries that are coming out of a civil war, don't really have a functional government in place, rampant, violence within the country. Libya, for instance, comes to mind. Several other countries in Africa come to mind. Syria comes to mind. Now, I think countries where there are very serious human rights violations, I don't see, frankly, why India stands up for state sovereignty at all. It's not in India's interest. It never has been for a while. Probably in the post-colonial paradigm in which Jawaharlal Nehru was functioning, it made some sense, as I explain in my book. But in today's context, it only actually weakens India's own credibility as a functional democratic power, because we're essentially telling these people that, this is your country, you do whatever the hell you want. And even if people are looking to India for moral support and, political support and all of those sorts of things, it's not forthcoming. So I think this is something that India does need to take a very serious view of in countries where there is rampant violence and violations of human rights.
Sure, there's a slight contradiction there,
That's
between
right.
its own political model and, how it views the rest of the world.
Absolutely.
That's very interesting. I think there's a lot of potential there with these platforms, as you say, creating feedback loops, knowledge transfer, putting countries on a more equal footing within these platforms such that people in policy can really sort of share their ideas together.
That's right.
It just gets me sort of thinking about my own platform, Mohammed. Towards the end of the book, you discuss India's understaffed diplomatic corps, and you point out that India's policy circles are perhaps too focused on domestic issues or India's interests rather than understanding what other countries may need from India.
Right.
I'm curious what you think is missing from India's think tank landscape here. Also, as I run a platform that is used by thousands of Indian policy grads and professionals to connect to other nodes in the global policy community, I can't help wondering what kind of role do you think policy people or other platforms like policy people could play to further internationalize Indian policy? How could we do this better? What do you think?
That's a very, very interesting question, because as I wrote that part of the book, I obviously wasn't thinking about sort of a private sector role. But since you bring it up, certainly, I think that the Delhi think tank landscape is, as you point out, very neighborhood centric, sort of closed off. And we do think about Indian foreign policy in a very transactional sense. We think about it, and most Indian think tanks do not have, as American think tanks do, we do not have Africa programs or Latin America programs or that sort of stuff, even East Asia programs for that matter. Increasingly, we've started to have one or two China programs come up.
I've seen that.
And a few people are looking at Africa in terms of investment and economic cooperation.
Okay.
But there's nothing that's studying the security or strategic or political aspects of these things relative to Africa or certainly other parts of the world. And so we need to start expanding that, I think, certainly. There's no reason why Indian think tanks cannot expand their operations in that manner. There are plenty of Indian scholars in different parts of the world that study the EU, that study, the Middle East, study even Latin America and other parts of the developing world. But they don't fit into the Indian think tank scene because Indian think tanks simply do not have space for them. They're not structured in a way that they've got programs that look at other countries and other parts of the world. And this is certainly a big problem for India because, first of all, if we do not understand other countries, how can we understand their interests? And if we don't understand their interests, how can we actually find common interests with them? And how can we fulfill those common political strategic interests? And so, it's a huge gaping gap, I think, in India's think tank capabilities. Ideally, I would think that when foreigners and foreign think tanks begin looking at India and New Delhi, ideally speaking, I would want to see the rest of the world investing in India's capabilities also in strategic thinking. And
Sure.
so I do want to see policy people and other policy forums around the world trying to set up a kind of an India cell maybe, and then bringing in India scholars into it, and then talking about India's foreign policy interests in a broader light beyond just Pakistan and China. Basically trying to disseminate this in some sense, both to global as well as the Indian audience. We see Carnegie, for instance, to some extent try to do this in India. Brookings was doing it until recently. So far as I know, again, the way that they study India in DC seems somewhat different from the way that they study in India in Delhi. In Delhi, they're largely, again, getting trapped in the Delhi mindset of we're looking at the neighborhood, we're looking at neighborhood linkages, and that's it. They're not setting up an Africa chapter in Carnegie, India. As far as I know, it doesn't exist. So there is no Latin America chapter under Carnegie, India. So they obviously are looking at it more from the American perspective than from India's needs and India's perspective. And the blame obviously also should lie at the doorstep of the Indian Foreign Ministry, because the Indian Foreign Ministry is not looking at the Delhi think tanks and saying, hey, we want research output on these other parts of the world as well, give it to us, and then create a demand for that. That demand simply doesn't exist as yet.
Right.
So my hope is that, if the government doesn't do it, if foreign think tanks don't do it, let at least the Indian people do it. I want to see a larger section of the Indian public, start approaching the media with an eye of, tell us what's happening in Venezuela, tell us what's happening in Lebanon, tell us what's happening in Hong Kong. And that is what I'm hoping my book actually does. I'm hoping that the book sort of tells the Indian reader that, look, you are in India, it's a very large country, it's a confusing country, but at the same time, a lot of what happens to you is also related to what happens in Hong Kong, in Lebanon, in Venezuela, and other parts of the world. So you should actually try to understand more about these other parts of the world. You should also hold the government more accountable for what it does in these other countries, and hold them, in some sense, hold the Indian government to a higher bar of expectations than what has been set so far.
Yeah, I think those are all very wise moves. And for example, there's no reason why people cannot take it upon themselves to do this, why the public cannot play a more active role.
That's right.
I mean, there are so many talented young professionals in India, and it seems to me, just having spoken to so many people that are, involved with my platform, policy people, it seems that, in India, policy as a sort of a sphere or industry almost is really catching on. There are a lot of Instagram accounts that people use to, create very interesting memes and graphics,
Right.
Showing different policy studies and things. There seems to be a lot of enthusiasm, especially with the young people in India, about policy right now. So I think
Yes.
there's a lot of potential, a lot of interest to tap into, a lot of talent. So I really do hope, your book can sort of further trigger more of this kind of action. And I hope policy people can facilitate, especially some of this interlinkage with the global community in policy as well. Yes, so there's so much to look forward to, Mohammed. But as I always like to ask on this show, what do you think are the key policy lessons that people in policy can draw from your book?
That is a difficult question, because obviously there are several pages that my answer go to, which is the entirety of the book. But I will try to distill it to a few points.
Sure.
I think the foremost point is we now live in a globalized, interconnected world. We are not in an isolated cocoon. So you cannot think, let the Syrian people die and struggle and do whatever they want. So far as it's not affecting me, I shouldn't care. It is going to affect you eventually, because these things have ripples in the global economy. They have ripples in international security. They're going to eventually turn up at your doorstep. So do not ignore what happens in other parts of the world. I think every country, in some sense today, not just large countries like India, emerging powers like India, but pretty much every country in the world today needs to take a much more internationalist view of their own development. The second thing is that, being inconsistent in foreign policy, being confused in foreign policy wins you no friends. I think that there is a sense in India, at least, that if you sit on the fence, nobody's going to hate you. And as a result, everybody's going to help you. That doesn't translate. Just because nobody hates you doesn't mean they're going to come to your help. They're going to come to your help if you're useful to them. And you're only going to be useful to them if they can trust you. And you're only going to be trusted if you're consistent in what you say and coherent and clear in what you stand for. So that, I think, at least in India's case, is one of the big takeaways of my book. Finally, number 3, in India's case, I think that no country in the world, including the United States, has as much of an incentive in the development and furtherance of democracy around the world as India does. And the underpinning argument of that obviously is that if India does not have democracy itself, then it has no standing to be a global power. Even India's economic growth, contrary to public perception, was actually fueled by Indian democracy. And I argue this in my book as well, the chapter on chapter 2 called The India Story. I say that India had a thirst with authoritarianism, if you will, under Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, the 2 years of emergency when essentially civil liberties were suspended. And although the Indian economy grew at the time, it grew for all the wrong reasons. And eventually that would have dissipated. As I said, it happened in Russia, it happened in Turkey, it would have happened in India as well. Luckily for India and for the rest of the world, Indira Gandhi called off the emergency for mysterious reasons within just 2 years and reinstated democracy. And so when economic growth came in a sustainable and steady manner in India, years later, it came through democratic change and democratic reform. It was under governments that were elected for the purpose of trying to pull India out of the funk that it had gotten into. If you didn't have elections, then the reformist government would never have come to power. If you didn't have the freedom to voice your opinion and say that this is what India needs, to debate what is good for India, for its society, for its economy, then that reform would never have come, because there is no way for the discussion to take place in the first place, for those answers to be revealed. So India became a reformed economy, a more globalized economy, a more efficient economy in the 1990s, not despite democracy, but because of it. So that, I think, is the big takeaway for India in its quest for global leadership.
Well, there's some very profound insights there, Mohamed. I'm very thankful that you were able to share them with our listeners today. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I think that's given us a lot to reflect on. Before we go, where can we find more about your work? Where can we get in touch with you if we'd like to? Can you tell our listeners more about what's happening? Do you have any other work coming up we should know about? Any follow-up books or anything like that?
Certainly. The easiest way to get in touch with me would be over Twitter or LinkedIn. Twitter, my handle is @ZMohammed_. So Mohammed spelled with a single M. On LinkedIn, of course, if you search me, I will show up, so you can pull me up there. You should certainly also check out the Freedom Gazette, which I'm the editor-in-chief of.
Okay.
It's a new policy advocacy initiative in India of young people who are coming together to try and find solutions to India's developmental needs and challenges, as well as India's external engagement and foreign policy. So that is something that you should check out, freedomgazette.in. And certainly on Twitter and LinkedIn, I will keep all of you posted on what happens, and certainly do go and read my book and tell me what you think about it.
Yes, we'll be linking to the book in the show notes. We have the digital copy out now. The print copy is coming soon, as I understand it?
Yes, the print copy can be pre-ordered globally. It's already available in India. It will be available abroad in May, and you can pre-order your hard copy already on Amazon.
Okay, I'll have the link to the Amazon page in the show notes, as well as your Twitter handle and the Freedom Gazette and everything else there. Mohamed, it's been a pleasure. I really want to thank you for giving us your time, Mohamed. Thank you for coming on the Policy People podcast.
Thank you for having me.
We look forward to speaking to you next time.
Thank you. A wonderful conversation. I've enjoyed this thoroughly. Thank you, Liam.
My pleasure.